Survivors, Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 14. Night fell, and the cloud cover was so thick that the moon was hidden. Molly sat quietly, listening to the steady, soft splash of Garrett's pulling. She was weary, but she couldn't sleep. "I lost the sack," Garrett told her, "and your mother's knife." Molly shook her head. "Damnable river," she said, then blushed because she had cursed. "Do you hear that?" Garrett asked suddenly. "A woman's voice?" Molly started to shake her head, but then a ruddy sparkle off to the west caught her eye. A fire? Without saying anything more, Garrett shifted direction, pulling toward it. The voices became more distinct as they got closer. Soon Molly could make out the group of people that were sitting around the fire. There were 15 or 20 of them. She could see tents, or maybe just blankets, hung on a line at the edge of the firelight. "Hello!" Garrett shouted as the raft glided close. The people fell silent instantly, and Garrett called out again. Molly stared at the fire, imagining its warmth as the people around it turned to stare in their direction. The raft ran gently aground, and she stood up slowly, leaning on Garrett as they stepped off. The strip of dry ground was long and narrow, and she could see car tracks in the mud. One man, carrying a torch, led 3 or 4 other men toward them. "It's what's left of our levee," she said quietly as they dragged the raft up out of the water. She heard Garrett make a sound of assent. She felt her nerves quieting. Just standing on solid ground made her less frightened. "Who's out there?" a man's voice rang out. "We're from up river," Garrett called back, brushing at his muddy pants. "From Mayersville." "We thought maybe you were the Red Cross folks," the man said, coming close enough that he didn't have to raise his voice. He lifted his torch high enough to light their faces. Behind him, Molly heard another man talking. "Go on back and tell Alice that it's just 2 children." Molly heard footsteps leaving as the man with the torch was leaning toward them. "When'd you eat last?" Molly saw Garrett smile. "Once today, but not the day before." "Come on up to the fire then, both of you. You can warm up some and eat supper." He gestured with the torch. As she and Garrett approached, Molly scanned the faces of the men and women waiting for them. There were no white people at all. She felt herself relax a little more. Then an older woman handed them tin plates of chicken and dumplings and settled them on overturned orange crates near the fire, and the rest of her weariness disappeared. "Did you see any boats?" a tall woman asked Molly. "A man in a flatboat, all loaded up with people, told us yesterday that somebody would be back to take us into Vicksburg." "We haven't seen anyone," Molly told her, "except an old man living in a cabin that was on high enough ground to still be dry." "And an airplane," Garrett added. The woman frowned. "Well, I expect he'll come any time now, and you children can just go with us." Molly waited until the women were talking among themselves. Then she leaned close to whisper to Garrett, "Vicksburg!" Garrett shrugged. "We've talked about it dozens of times, but I never thought it'd come like this," he said quietly. "We ought to be able to find someone there who will take us up river." Molly nodded. It made sense. She sat silently, happy to be off the water. Slowly the fire warmed her, drying her dress. The hot food was unbelievably delicious, and the conversation swirled around her. "We saw 2 or 3 planes yesterday," the tall woman was saying, "but they sure didn't seem to see us." All the way down from Mayersville on that little raft?" the older woman asked as she ladled up more dumplings. Molly listened to Garrett as he answered politely. It was suddenly very hard for her to stop yawning. She tried not to be rude. The truth was, as soon as she had finished eating, the warmth of the fire made her drowsy. By the time the older woman led them to pallets of blankets crowded into a canvas and plank lean-to, Molly could only mumble a thank you and lie down. "Boat! I hear a boat!" The shout woke Garrett with a start. For a few seconds he was confused. Then he looked out of the lean-to at the world of brown water and remembered where he was. He untangled himself from the blankets and stood up. The men were already down by the water's edge. Molly was with 4 or 5 women hurrying toward the men. For the first time he saw there were 2 horses at the far end of the levee, grazing on the short grass that grew at the water's edge. The day had dawned cloudy, and the sky was the color of lead. Looking out across the flooded land, Garrett could see a few other high points, and he wondered if people and animals were stranded on every one of them. Garrett could hear the boat motor clearly now, and after a minute he spotted it, chugging out from behind a copse of trees. Garrett went to stand with everyone else near the water. The boatman cut the motor and tipped it forward as the skiff glided in. "How many are here?" he demanded. The man who had carried the torch stepped forward. 11 of us. Then he pointed at Garrett and Molly. "These two are from up Marysville way. Came all the way on that little old raft, and they—" "Load up now," the man interrupted, "and I'll get you all down to Vicksburg." Garrett cleared his throat. "We want to go back up river, mister," he said politely. "Molly and me, I mean. You think we can find someone to take us?" The boatman's eyes raked him up and down, then he spat into the water. "Your best bet is in Vicksburg, son. Half of Mississippi is in the refugee camps there." He spat again, looking around at the little section of levee. "You'll find a northbound boat easier from there than from here, I expect." Garrett glanced at Molly. She had moved aside. The women were trailing up and down the path, bringing their few belongings to load into the boat. The boatman looked bored, staring out over the water. Garrett worked his way through the little knot of people and went to stand beside Molly. "I hate to leave the raft," Garrett said. Molly nodded. "We'll build another one." "You two about ready?" the boatman asked abruptly. Garrett turned to see that the skiff had been pushed back into the water. The women were already sitting in it. The men were taking turns getting aboard. Molly went to share a bench with the tall woman. Garrett waited his turn, then got on and stood near the boatman. "We met an old man still in his cabin," Garrett told him, "on a little patch of high ground west of here and north, I guess. It was upstream." The boatman nodded brusquely. "I'll keep an eye out and pass the word." As the motor sputtered to life, Garrett turned backward, staring at the raft as they moved out into the sluggish water. He saw Molly looking back, too. He kept the raft in sight as long as he could, then faced front. The woman kept up a conversation to pass the time, but Molly found she had little to say. The brown water slid beneath the boat, and the droning of the motor grated at her ears. Finally the boatman turned. "This is Vicksburg's, folks. I'm going to let you off up here on the levee above the graveyard," he shouted. Molly followed his gesture. The levee was lined with boats of all sizes. There were oil and cargo barges, too, and the tugboats that had pushed them here. People stood shoulder to shoulder on them. There were no benches or seats. Someone had strung on low chicken wire fence, probably, Molly thought, to keep people from falling off. Molly let Garrett lead the way as they jumped from the boat to the levee, then turned back. "Mister, there's an old man with a dog stranded out." "The boy told me, miss," the boatman interrupted. She nodded and hurried to catch up with Garrett. The crowds made her nervous. There were hundreds of people milling around. Families stood in loose groups beside stacks of trunks and quilts. One woman had a rooster in a wire crate, and an old man was cradling a Victrola, like a child. Most people didn't have much except what they were wearing. One little boy was coughing so hard that Molly couldn't bear to watch. She scanned the dizzying mosaic of faces. White-aproned women made their way through the throng. Some of them wore white scarves with red crosses printed on the cloth. Molly stumbled on the muddy ground, accidentally shoving a man in front of her. He turned, scowling. "I'm so sorry," Molly said quickly. He nodded brusquely. Molly stared after him as he walked away, wishing her father were there to take care of her. "You all right?" Garrett asked, startling her. She spun around to look into his eyes. "Yes? No? I just want to go home." She looked at the milling mass of people. There were a dozen babies wailing all at once. A man with a bloody bandage around his head was arguing with two other men. "Let's go ask how we can get back up river," Garrett said. Leading off, he stepped around two men carrying a stretcher. Molly glanced down as she passed, wincing when she saw an elderly woman, a little trickle of blood at the side of her mouth. Her eyes were open, but Molly was pretty sure she was dead. "This way," Garrett said over his shoulder, and Molly ran a few steps to catch up. She could see some kind of line forming in front of two white-aproned women. People were dragging their feet, shuffling along. Everyone looked weary. Molly nearly ran into Garrett as a big man with a blond mustache blocked their path. His arms spread out like he was shooing chickens. "Have you registered yet?" he asked Garrett. "Are you a lone boy?" "Registered?" Molly heard Garrett ask. The man adjusted his hat. "Registered. A tag. Do you have a tag? You're not from Vicksburg, are you? We don't allow the local children to come up to the camps, you know." Garrett shook his head. "We're from Marysville." "Where's your family, son?" the big man asked, looking from Garrett to Molly, then back. "You need to get a hold of your folks, and your friend here should go on up and get her tag. Were her parents on the last barge?" No, sir, Garrett answered. Molly shook her head when the man shifted his gaze to her face. My folks are back home, she said quietly. Both of you need to get registered, the man said, his voice loud, even over the noise of the crowds. Negroes over there. He pointed his eyes on Molly. Then he turned to Garrett. Son, you can come with me. Molly looked at the mud beneath her feet. Of course, the refugee camps would be segregated. She just hadn't thought about it. Thank you, sir, Garrett was saying clearly, looking up into the man's face. We sure do thank you for the advice. Garrett stood stiffly, his shoulders squared, his chin jutted out. Molly felt sick, like the world was shifting beneath her feet. The white man said something else to Garrett and clapped him on the back. Then he strode off. Molly swallowed, her heart beating fast. She didn't want to be alone, surrounded by so many people, and all of them strangers. Garrett tilted his head, gesturing for her to follow. He walked along the edge of the levee to avoid the worst of the crowds. Across an expanse of brown water, Molly could see the town of Vicksburg rising up on hills that looked huge. She could see cars in the streets. Garrett stopped, and she almost stepped on his heels. You don't want to go to the camp, do you? She shook her head instantly. No, my folks won't come here. My pa said he wasn't leaving the farm for anything. Garrett nodded. My mama's aunt, Julia Pearl, teaches school up in Yazoo County. Mama was talking about going there if the water got too high. Garrett rubbed one hand across his face. All right, you wait here, and I'll see if I can get someone to take us back upriver. Molly watched him walk away. A little sprinkle of rain started up, cold against her face. She shivered, hugging herself. Garrett approached a man in a blue uniform jacket. The man gestured and shook his head. Then he pointed, and Molly saw Garrett nod and walk up on the levee. A moment later he disappeared into the crowd. Molly shivered again. It was raining harder, and it was all she could do to stand the milling and noise and the people around her. By the time Garrett finally came trotting back out of the crowd, she was biting at her lower lip. As he got closer, she could see he was smiling. There's a supply boat going up to Mayersville in about an hour. All we have to do is wait. Molly started crying. She couldn't help herself. Now, if their families were safe, everything was going to be all right.